Okay, so we're going to go ahead and do our last talk in this room. So, Barry Fagin, you come forward.
All the few, the crowd. As someone who's given lots of talks and lots of conferences, I dread giving the last talk or the last day of the session. There's never anybody there. But I know this time we have the few, the faithful. If I can use that term. So I'm going to talk about something that I don't have any slides for. It's not primarily a visual presentation. It's more of a personal one. I'm going to talk about something that I don't think skeptics talk enough about or pay enough attention to. And that is our inner subjective personal experiences about how it feels to be a skeptic. Because among other things, I think it feels really great. And I think that the rest of the world needs to know that, particularly if we're interested in winning the hearts and minds of the rest of our fellow humans. And I think ultimately we are. I mean, we are, in some sense, evangelicals for a particular perspective. And I think that's okay. So let me begin by reading you the following statement. So if you were to rewind the clock to the beginning of time, it couldn't be any other way. When all is said and done, the universe ends in cold death and darkness. Existence then is ultimately meaningless. This is the essence of what Dr. Fagin believes. Christians believe otherwise. So that's a quote from an evangelical pastor on a panel with me at Classical Academy High School, addressing their worldview class. All the seniors participate in a class known as the worldview class. Now, the title itself is disingenuous because the idea that everybody has a worldview of which Christianity is one, and in some sense they're all sort of equivalent in that they're all different worldviews, so we pick one. We can choose which one to adopt. That in itself a characteristically modern Christian perspective. Christians believe themselves to be under attack in modern society, or at least that's my perspective. And in intellectual circles in particular, they see intellectualism and academic inquiry and science and so forth, and the university intellectual establishment in particular, which I may claim myself as a part, they see that as hostile to faith and hostile to Christianity and evangelical Christianity in particular. So they argue that their worldview is just as deserving of consideration and or First Amendment protection in particular, and it's something I have an interest in, as any other worldview. And in some sense, of course, they're quite right. But so the idea that there are many worldviews and Christianity is one, and so that's in itself a very modern Christian perspective, which is disproportionately presented at places like the Classical Academy. So what that ignores is that everybody, the difference I think with skepticism is that everybody is a skeptic about everybody else's religion, right? We are like everyone, Christians are very skeptical of Mormon claims and very skeptical of Muslim claims, but just not skeptical about their own. Everyone accepts the huge majority of the conclusions that skepticism and science have generated. Or there's some portion that's present everywhere. So it's not as if there's all these different worldviews don't overlap. Skepticism and science present a core that virtually every educated person, regardless of what their worldview is. So that right away is the way that the form is presented is somewhat disingenuous. So Christian apologists are also very sympathetic to many arguments of the left and postmodern academic theory, the idea that ultimately we can't have objective knowledge about the world, but we can't escape our own perspectives. The difference is that Christians believe that we need faith to sort of get out of the trap, to get out of the problem. And in that sense, they're very sympathetic to leftist and academic literary theories and postmodernist arguments. So later, when I was talking to the seniors in their rhetoric class, one student told me that basically after sort of hearing my spiel, he said that I wasn't, quote, offering hope to people, unquote. So to me, that was an argument that skepticism is different from the other worldviews that they were saying, because that's religion's job. And skepticism really isn't a religion. Perhaps it's something different. But it also got me to thinking. People ultimately are not convinced by rational arguments, or at least not entirely by them. I don't think any of us got to skepticism solely for the rational means. I think people don't understand skepticism particularly well, And even when they do understand it, they think that the inner subjective emotional life of a skeptic must be cold and barren and ultimately unfulfilling. We're always negative. We're puncturing everyone's balloon. We're killjoys. We're taking away their teddy bear, and all those kinds of things. So I think that view is mistaken. And in fact, I think we have the good news, and we ought to share the good news. There's no reason why we shouldn't feel comfortable doing that. Most of us are skeptics precisely because we find it fulfilling. There is absolutely an emotional component to what we do. In that sense, that's part of what makes us human. Our beliefs and how we reason are very much driven subconsciously, and that's okay. I think it would be good for us to talk more about why that is so. Let me diverge just briefly to say that I feel really bad about the fact that I didn't leave enough time for questions at my last talk. So this talk is going to be much shorter, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions about skepticism and politics, or some of the other stuff for people to talk about. We should have plenty of time to do that. So again, I apologize for that. Thank you for your indulgence. All right, so many people equate skepticism with nihilism. That's with the absence of belief. You guys don't believe anything. So but that's not right. That's not correct, as Mike Shermer and on the other side, many religious thinkers have pointed out. Human beings are absolutely creatures of belief. That is what we do. We believe in all sorts of stuff. And I believe that this computer has object permanence and isn't going to spontaneously disappear or combust or turn into something else. There's all sorts of things. That's not faith. That's a belief that's formed by our experience. So without belief, we can't act, we can't feel, we can't do much of anything. So we are not hostile to belief, far from it. We recognize that belief is an intrinsic part of being human. It's like part of the human experience. It's what we do, and it's great. It's great. So skeptics, like all normal, functioning, fulfilled humans, we believe things all the time. We don't question everything. That's not what skepticism is. We don't doubt everything. That's not what skepticism is either. There's a wonderful scene in a Molière play where a young man who is searching for truth comes to talk to a philosopher, and the philosopher who is labeled a skeptic, unfortunately, perhaps it's in the philosophical sense that my colleague was talking about, tells the young student he should doubt everything. And finally, the young searcher of truth gets so disgusted with what is obviously bullshit that he smacks the guy. And the guy goes, "Ow! Look at you!" So, well, are you sure you're hurting me? We should doubt whether or not your pain is real. How do you know your pain is real? It's crazy important. I mean, it's a wonderful scene. It's very, very funny. But it underscores an important misconception, I think. So we don't question everything. It's not like we doubt everything. We simply question when the strangeness of the claim is out of sync with the available evidence. When the claim is so completely outside of our everyday experience, then we ask what the evidence is, and we expect it to be in proportion to that. That's what extraordinary claims require. Extraordinary evidence means. That's, I think, the soundbite of skepticism, if you must reduce it to something like that. So that, and we don't care how many people believe something. It doesn't matter if 3 people or 3 billion people believe it. That's evidence that people believe in something. That's enormous evidence that people believe in something. But it's not really evidence that the thing they believe is true. We don't care about how old the belief is, how established it is, how traditional it is, or ultimately how the belief makes us feel. We care about whether or not it's true. That's, I think, our passion. That's what motivates us. Nor, and this is really important, nor do we require proof. When you're discussing skepticism, when you're engaging someone on the other side, you shouldn't let critics use the P word. Right? They'll sneak that into the discussion. They'll say things like, well, can you prove that your mother loves you, or can you prove that your wife or your husband loves you? I can't prove 100% that there is a God. So don't let them go there. You're not asking for proof. In fact, in my opinion, the word proof has no place outside of a mathematical or logical context. In mathematics, I understand what a proof is. I understand what the theorem is. In that context, it's perfectly appropriate. But in terms of theology or philosophy or evidence, proof, I think, is it's a language game. It means something very different. Biblical scholars and Christian apologists, in fact, will talk about proof texts.
texts. That is, they will state something, they will cite a Bible verse in support of it and say, that's a proof. Okay, so obviously it's something very, very different from either of the other two uses of the word proof. So don't let them go there. You don't need to talk about proof. You are not asking for proof. You are asking about evidence. A much more productive way to have the discussion. And getting back to the question of love, there is enormous evidence that my mother loved me. She died 3 years ago. And there's no evidence to the contrary. On the other hand, there could be evidence that my mother did not love me. Many people, sadly, have direct experience that their mother didn't love them, or that their wife didn't love them after all, even though they thought they did. And what do? Right? What does a man who's convinced that his wife loves him and then comes home early from work and finds her in bed with another man? He changes his mind. Right? He says, oh, God, she doesn't love me, or she doesn't love me anymore. Right? There's nothing about love, or the things that we supposedly aren't able to prove, that requires you to have any discussion of anything outside of evidence. There is nothing supernatural about it. No reason why you can't have a discussion, you can't form your beliefs about love based on evidence, right, as opposed to proof. So the point is, things like love are absolutely within the purview of evidence. When you are discussing their existence or non-existence, people change their minds about love when the evidence says they should. So the question is not about proof. The question is about evidence. And we can argue, and so can theologians, etc., about what constitutes evidence. Oh, you guys are only talking about empirical evidence, but what about spiritual evidence? What about evidence of the heart, etc., etc.? And at some point during the Q&A, if you want, we can talk about that. So now this room needs no convincing that the skeptical perspective is the one best suited to discovering the nature of the world as it is, to identifying things that are factually true. But I want to go one step further. I want to talk about something that I don't think we are giving enough attention to. Skepticism is, I would argue, extremely fulfilling and emotionally satisfying in a way that, in my opinion, anything that is purely faith-based can never be. And I think we should be very proactive, if we feel that way, about sharing that with the rest of the world. Christian apologists love to cast things in terms of duels and saying that you have to choose. They think they've sort of spelled out all the options and it's either this or this and you have to choose. So I have, at one time or another, I've had to deal with the following arguments. Either truth is man-made or it is revealed. When you have eliminated all natural explanations, the supernatural one must be the correct one. If evolution is correct, then mankind does not need to be redeemed from sin, and the death of Jesus means nothing. And so, now that one, you all will probably buy. Right? You don't find that necessarily a false dichotomy. If there is no God, then there is no right and wrong, and life is ultimately meaningless. Right? Either there is a God or not. This is a very popular one, popularized by, I think this was C.S. Lewis. Jesus was either a liar, the Son of God, or crazy. Right? This is the liar, lawyer, lunatic argument. And basically, he says all the things that he says. He was either a liar, or he was crazy, or he really was who he says he was. Right? That's sort of all the possibilities, and that's kind of the deal. So that's actually a false trichotomy, I think, that you get the idea. Jesus really was resurrected because thousands of people were willing to risk death in his time by proclaiming that he was. So therefore, either he was resurrected or all these thousands of people could possibly be right, could possibly be wrong. So that's the kind of arguments that they make. They think they've sort of spelled out everything that you have to choose. So you all can see the problems that are associated with this thinking, if you want to call it that. But I want to make a different point. What distinguishes the faith-based believer from the skeptic is what I think we find, what the different groups find emotionally satisfying. Believers find certainty satisfying. I think that's a key difference. They believe that they see all the possibilities and they choose the one that they are certain of, or at least certain enough of, and then they make the leap of faith that gets them over to from likelihood to certainty. That's how I paraphrase it that way. So the difference is that a skeptic is willing to say, I don't know. I don't know. Maybe there's a possibility we haven't thought of yet. In fact, this is a key point, I think, because a skeptic prefers an honest, I don't know, to a faith-based, I believe. That, I think, is the key difference. What the emotional satisfaction, the emotional resonance of those two approaches. We believe, I think, that faith-based beliefs are intellectually dishonest. That I think is a fair way of summarizing what most skeptics would believe. So that's because for us, and I apologize, I'm presuming to speak for you, but it's really not true, but I think for us, intellectual integrity is everything. Intellectual integrity is so important to a skeptic. We so hate to make stuff up. We so hate to lie. And we think that self-deception is a form of lying. We don't want to lie to anybody, especially ourselves. Especially ourselves. And as others have said, ourselves are the easiest ones to fool. So rather than err on the side of belief, as, for example, my good friend and former New Life associate pastor Rob Brendel has advised, he thinks he wants to err on the side of belief. He wants to err on the side of faith. We err on the side of skepticism because we value our intellectual integrity more, I think, than he does. I think that's the key difference. We don't like to, as a previous speaker said, make stuff up. We don't like to do that. We find that unsatisfying. We will change our minds when the evidence says we should, or at least that's the ideal we aspire to, right? All of us have our, as Penn and Teller say, our little creeds, right? About these little things that we're reluctant to let go. But at least that's the public ideal that we aspire to be. Are publicly accountable in that way. We say this is the ideal that we aspire to, so that everyone, even Christians, and even believers, our critics will hold us to that. They will say, oh yeah, but you haven't thought about this evidence. We should at least be willing to consider it. So that's important. I think that's a good thing. So that is, I would argue, not only the best process for discovering the truth, but it's ultimately morally and ethically inspiring. I think that our willingness to change our minds in the face of evidence is morally and ethically inspiring. I think that's really, really important. Despite the claims of morality, the unique claims of morality and ethics that a person of deep religious faith may make, and not all of them do, but those that do, you can trust skeptics in certain ways that you can't trust a believer on certain things. You can trust us to change our minds given the evidence. That's a really cool thing. That's a valuable thing. That is something that other people can be persuaded of and recognize as morally and ethically important and valuable. You can trust us to change our minds. Ideally, I think, on anything, including skepticism. Yes, you can be skeptical about skepticism, etc., given sufficient evidence. So I think that counts for something. There is a certain honesty to a skeptic's I don't know, and a certain hopefulness. Because with every I don't know, there is an implied, but I might know someday. But we might know someday. But we might know more someday. There's an implied optimism, an upbeat thinking about the future. I think skepticism is very progressive in that sense, very forward-thinking. A skeptic is an implied optimist because we see skepticism, or at least I do, as contributing to human progress, to an increasing base of knowledge about the world and an increasing base of human wisdom that hopefully will enable us to survive and prosper so that we can be around in some form a few billion years from now at the end of the universe and maybe fix that little glitch that is causing the universe to collapse and fix it so it won't happen anymore. It won't be like billions of years from now. That's a long time, right? Even for in geological terms. So, when a skeptic is asked what will happen to humanity at the end of time or at the end of the universe, we should say we don't know, because we think that's the intellectually honest thing to say. It's not a surrender, it's not giving up. It's an intellectually honest thing to say. And we are ethical and moral people who value intellectual honesty. We think that's important. Better still, so we could say we don't yet know because we've got a few billion years to find out. That's that we can figure out a lot of stuff in a few billion years. But we would rather have an honest, we don't yet know, than a faith-based, we believe, because we think that's wrong. We think that it is intellectually dishonest. It is emotionally, for us, unfulfilling. We absolutely recognize the all-too-human predilection to seek comfort, to gain acceptance, to conform, to ignore evidence that conflicts with deeply held beliefs in order to believe. That's a very authentically human perspective to have. The difference is that we don't want to succumb to it. Right? We think that's a bad thing. We think that's a primitive thing. We think humans can be better. That temptation, that desire is a part of our humanity. It is an important part of our humanity. We should embrace it. We should understand it. But it ought to be something that we should transcend, not something that we should succumb to. Right? We want to rage against the dying of the light. Right? That's what we do. That is what skeptics do anyway, and that's exactly what we should be doing. So ultimately, I think that this is a personal and emotional choice, just as faith might be a personal and emotional choice for a believer. I suppose that's what my pastor friends would argue when they say that skepticism is just a form of faith. Like anything else, maybe that's what they mean. But even so, we ought to get the word out about how good it feels to be a skeptic. If for no other reason, then that is how ultimately we will change people's minds. Not every discussion is futile. Those of you who heard my colleague and good friend Carlos Berthas talk this morning about how at some point you have these, if you're a skeptic discussing with a fetus, then at some point you just have to throw up your hands and say, we're done. We have to agree to disagree agreeably. But not all discussions are like that. There are other conversations that happen, sometimes without you even realizing it, with people who aren't convinced one way or the other. Maybe someone just happens to be listening, sitting in the booth behind you in a restaurant. Maybe someone's reading the letter to the editor that you wrote. They never heard about any of this stuff before. I think that we can win any reason-based battle, but those really aren't all that interesting. Right? Typically, because we're looking to win hearts and minds. We're looking to win hearts and minds, not simply minds. The reason the other side, I think, has been so much more successful than we have, first of all, they've been at it for a lot longer, but it's also because we neglect the former at the expense of the latter. So, people, I think, just to sum up, being a skeptic feels good, and I'm not sure everybody knows that. Right? Being a skeptic feels really good. I think we are engaged with and understand the world in a way that believers cannot match. The evidence is enormous that every single scientific discovery, everything that humanity is going to find out about the world, of the past as well, every archaeological discovery about the world, about the past, present, and future, everything we're going to find out about the mind itself, neuroscience. We had a wonderful neuroscience MD give a talk about this. Think about all those things that we're going to find out over the next 100, 200, or 1,000 years. None of that, I would argue, will require us to backtrack or revise or undo anything that we believe as skeptics. What are the chances? I mean, now, once everything that we want to know, well, so can any religion say the same thing? Can any believers say the same thing? I think not. When everything that happens in the world is available online, and we're sort of almost there, right? It takes maybe a couple of petabytes of storage for you to digitize everything that a person's entire life, right? Everything that a person has seen. You could conceivably upload and put it there. Given so much of the human experience that is now online and checkable, isn't it sort of weird that no one has ever captured the supernatural experience and uploaded it to YouTube? I mean, doesn't that seem sort of funny? There's so many opportunities now to capture and replicate all these supernatural weird things that are supposed to happen. We haven't seen any of them, and I think we're not going to. So what are the implications of that? Well, what kind of apologetics will believers in the supernatural have to write? 100 years from now, or whatever, when still no evidence of the supernatural is found. And if it is found, I, of course, will change my mind. But assuming that's not, how's that going to make believers look? What kind of apologetics will they have to develop? I will give you a hint. They have already started. They've already started. There's a former physicist, now a Catholic priest, who said things like, can we distinguish religion from mental illness? should we try saying things like, someone else has said things like, well, if the religious experience turns out to have to be totally based in the brain, that's because God is the hand and the brain is the glove. That's how God works. Right? We are wired to believe. So you're already starting, and okay, fine, whatever. So just to finish up, so the next time you're talking with someone about some cool scientific discovery that's made the news, share your excitement with them. Our previous speaker talked about beautiful soils. That's great. That's exactly what we need. These soil samples, these things are beautiful. They are things of beauty. When we contemplate the world as it is a thing of beauty. It is a beautiful thing. Instead of emphasizing the negative when we tear down yet another ridiculous claim, right? Talk about how it's a positive step for learning more about the world. What a great and noble enterprise that such a thing is. If you got kids, share the excitement of your journey with them. My kids are now essentially grown up. Not hard to raise skeptical kids. It's a real pleasure. It's a real joy. Find a like-minded teacher at your kid's school. Get some buzz going about teaching critical thinking in middle school botany or something like that. A kid's science class, very easy to do. Psychology elective for high school seniors. Get some critical thinking and stuff going on. Very easy, very easy. Volunteer at a homeless shelter or a dog pound or a local nonprofit and make no secret about how it is that's precisely because you give a damn about humanity that you are a skeptic. That's precisely why. Right? Because you do care. So anyway, you get the idea. So unless and until, I would argue, we start engaging people's hearts as well as their minds, we will not have the impact on the world that I think we all want. And it is an impact that I believe humanity desperately, desperately needs. Thank you.